Oh,
would
certainly.
Would that make sense, and would that register in the same part of the brain?
Well, we don't know if it registers in the same part of the brain. Certainly, the conscious experience of having insight, there's something unique about that seems to be in common with lots of different domains. So whether you have an insight about a geometry problem, an insight about yourself and what you like, what you don't like, an insight about politics, or there's something common to all of those in terms of this aha experience. Now, we don't know whether that common experience can be attributed to the same kind of brain mechanism. I mean, we're going to have to apply these kinds of research techniques to lots of different areas and see, does the same part of the brain light up all the time? Or are there different eureka parts of the brain, say one eureka part of the brain for mathematical problems, another eureka part of the brain for self-awareness, like in psychotherapy when you have a sudden understanding about yourself, or another eureka part of the brain for artistic creation. We just don't know that yet.
And I guess some of these cases will be harder to set up controls for than others. I mean, obviously to have a problem like the one you gave is relatively easy, but a problem that involves, writing a poem or something of that sort would be harder to test, I would imagine.
Right. And if you, in certain areas, for instance, self-awareness, a sudden insight about oneself, you can't really have the person, you don't know when and if a person's going to have that insight. And you can't follow them around with brain scanning equipment and just hope that it'll happen and get enough of those people to, so that's very hard to do. But with usually researchers come on some creative way to capture things like that in a laboratory. It's only a matter of time.
Yeah, or to prime people so that they're prepared to have that insight on command. What about insights that are wrong? I guess that doesn't matter. So long as you experience this as an insight, if you get the wrong answer, will it still register in the way that you say?
Well, that's hard to say at this point. In the studies we've done, when a person has a self-reported insight, they were almost always correct. So they didn't make enough errors for us to be even to analyze them. Now, certainly, whenever we have an aha moment or eureka moment, that doesn't necessarily mean we're correct. But based on the research that's been done already, usually when the person has that experience of the sudden revelation, usually it's correct, or it's at least more likely to be correct than a solution you come up with that isn't accompanied by that kind of experience.
That makes sense, because you wouldn't have that sense of certainty.
Right.
What about aids that we think of that help us think or help us think quickly? Caffeine, for example. Ritalin, as a more extreme case. Have you studied any subjects that are before and after the taking of these drugs in terms of how it helps with these moments?
No one's done that yet, and that's something that's on the agenda. But there does seem to be some evidence that anything that causes a person to focus, like caffeine, may actually inhibit creative insights. Now, it wouldn't necessarily inhibit other kinds of work on creative endeavors. So, for instance, you can have an aha moment, and then you have a lot of thinking to do. Say, in the case of writing a poem or writing a novel, a lot of it is step-by-step intellectual work in order to polish it, fit it into a structure and all that, and that might benefit from, say, caffeine. But there's evidence that when people are in a lower state of arousal and their attention is more spread out, that they're more likely to have the insight itself. So, for instance, a lot of people get some of their best ideas in the shower. For instance, I know I do. And because in the shower, you're not bombarded by stimuli. It's kind of white noise, it's kind of sensory deprivation. Your level of arousal, you relax, and your attention spreads out, and then you can tap into these ideas.
Tell us what some of the implications are as you see them for this discovery. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of people, accident victims, or people who have had injuries of various sorts. Have you thought in terms of that?
Well, a little bit, yes. For instance, if further research bears out the idea that the brain temporarily cuts off sensory information just before an insight, Well, that would mean you wouldn't necessarily want to be thinking about certain kinds of problems while driving, for instance. You know,
Yeah.
that might, for a moment, impair your vision or your hearing.
Yeah.
Okay? More generally, I think everyone is interested in developing a technology of creativity. In other words, what can we do to enhance creativity in certain circumstances, but also to inhibit it in other circumstances? We don't always want to be creative.
Right.
We want to be creative when solving a problem or writing a poem, but we don't want to be creative while balancing a checkbook or something like that.
Right,
We want to use something very step-by-step, very mundane. So we want to enhance creativity in certain circumstances and inhibit it in other circumstances. And any kind of technology involving, for instance, drugs, involving just manipulations of the environment that will help a person to spread their attention out may enhance creative insights, and anything that will arouse the person, get them to focus, would likely inhibit it, but then also enhance their ability to solve other kinds of so for instance, if you drink a cup of coffee, you might be less likely to write a creative poem, but more likely to balance your checkbook correctly.
Okay.
Something like that.
Or take a test well,
Yes.
for example.
Certain kinds of tests,
yeah.
yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
that don't involve creative
Right.
insight.
Exactly.
Have drug companies been approached you? I mean, has there been can you see some medical technologies associated with what you're doing, and has there been an interest in that on that side?
It's too new. I think that will come. I think there's the drug companies are extremely interested in developing drugs that will enhance certain areas of cognition. So, for instance, memory improvement there's a lot of research money being spent to develop drugs that will improve memory, both in people who have impaired memory, but even improve memory in people who have normal memory.
Right.
There are drugs that are being developed, and some even out there, for to allow people to think clearly even if they've been sleep deprived. And the military is very interested in that as well. There's been less interest so far in developing drugs that would enhance things like creative insight and things like that, but it's just because it's too new.
It may be that it's too new, and it's also maybe that the market for it is not as large, in the sense that I'm thinking here of poets and writers who might want to overcome writer's block. They don't really have much leverage in the marketplace.
Well, but I think
I mean, I would love a drug to help me to overcome writer's block, for example.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think, though, if a drug like this were developed and it were marketed as something that will enhance your creativity in all spheres of one's life, I think there probably would be a lot of interest in it. But a drug that would be specifically for writer's block, that would probably have a limited market.
We'd have to call it the creative drug.
Limited but devoted market.
Yes,
That's right.
well, yeah, it might be larger than you think. How did you become interested in this notion? I mean, it is in a way unorthodox, I would say. I mean, as you say, other studies have been done on memory or on more, definable aspects of thought. But the notion of creativity is ineffable, in a sense. I mean, we tend to think of it that way. What made you decide that this was something you could study and narrow in the way that you've done?
Well, cognitive psychology has been around since the 1950s, and aspects of it earlier. But cognitive psychology got a big boost in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, when brain scanning techniques were really developed and made popular, and we could start looking at what the brain was doing. So starting in around 1990 or so, researchers started applying these brain scanning techniques to what was easiest to study. And in cognitive psychology, simpler processes are easier to study. It's easier to study visual perception than it is to study creativity.
Right.
So people started doing the easier things first. And then, as the technologies improved and they got more experience with them, they're just starting now to tackle the more complex sorts of things. There's been virtually no work done on the brain mechanisms of creativity. Very, very little. It's only starting now. So that's one of the, I mean, aside from its obvious intrinsic interest, creativity in the brain, it's also an area where there's a need for more research. So researchers are motivated both by the intrinsic interest of something and the practical aspect of, here's an area that one can get involved in and make a contribution, because there just hasn't been much done.
And specifically how you became involved in it? I mean, what was the process leading up to your eureka moment of getting involved in this kind of research?
There were a couple of stages. Actually, I came to it from a very theoretical standpoint originally. There are theories in cognitive psychology that talk about whether mental processes occur gradually and change gradually over time, or occur in sort of a sudden all or none fashion. And a lot of the research that's been done show these kinds of gradually continuously changing mental processes, and very little that showed all or none processing. So originally my idea is, well, I want to see if there's this other kind of mental process that occurs suddenly. And looking back at the literature, there was this old literature suggesting these eureka moments might be a good place to start. So I got into that, and then from there started saying, well, this raises all sorts of other interesting issues about creativity in general that became
it's
of
a cornucopia, it seems to me, of potential research. And your collaborator is somebody that you linked up with after you began this work, or had you been working together?
Well, we had both been working separately on this issue, Mark Jung-Beeman and I, and then we were at the same institution for a while, and we started collaborating, and then we've been collaborating together for a few years now on this topic.
Well, it's exciting. The whole notion of the mind-body connection that this suggests, have you thought about this? I mean, obviously that's the great philosophical question, and one that has not been answered. Do you feel that you're moving toward an answer that might have large philosophical implications beyond the actual practical ones that are obviously derivable from what you're doing?
Yes and no.
Okay.
In the last 10 years, the whole area of what the neural basis of consciousness is and mind has taken off, and taken off in the sense that there are a lot of people working on it, but also there are very few good answers. It's been divided up into sort of an easy question and a hard question, or should I say a hard question and a less hard question. They're all hard questions. The easier question is, can we point to something in the brain, a mechanism, an area of the brain, that seems to correspond to conscious mind, conscious thought? And yes, I think there are some good answers to that, or at least some good evidence. In our own study, we showed that this sudden burst of high-frequency gamma waves, this high-frequency EEG activity in the right hemisphere, seems to correspond to a solution popping into awareness. So one could say that is a brain correlate or a brain mechanism associated with consciousness. And I think there's pretty good evidence for that. However, the older philosophical question about what is consciousness and its relationship to the body and the brain, nobody has any good answer to that.
And this
yet.
really
That's
doesn't
the hard
explain
question.
that. Yeah.
That's the hard question, and people are wrestling over that. And I think, some philosophers have argued we will never solve that problem. Others argue, sure, it's just not any kind of solution we can envisage at this point. But that's the real ultimate challenge.
But wherever it is, it's way down the road from where you are now.
Yeah.
But still, what you're doing strikes me as enormously exciting, and I look forward. I'm glad to have you at my institution, and I'm glad to have you here today, Dr. Kounios, at the Drexel interview. Thank you.
Thanks.